personally, I'm going to give a few opening remarks, but I really love the questions. So I'm really looking forward to that part and any questions that you might have about coercive diplomacy. So I came to ASPI about 3 or 4 years ago, and one of the big gaps that I saw then when I joined was, and I've seen this in Australian think tanks, and I think it's still a problem globally, is a lack of Chinese-speaking analysts able to understand China in its own words, what its leaders are saying they're doing and what they are actually doing on the ground. And that's really important, not just for Australia, because China's so important to us. It's our largest trading partner. It's our largest source of foreign students. It's a very deep partner across a range of fronts, but obviously for geopolitical and strategic reasons, it's really important to understand, the rise in China and what that means. So we've tried to understand China using Chinese speakers. We have a team of about 30 people in my center. And this is one of those projects that we undertook. The reason why we did it was I've been noticing for quite a while that the Chinese Communist Party was deploying coercive diplomacy against foreign governments and companies, but it wasn't very well understood, and both countries and governments were doing a terrible job in responding to it. And they hadn't quite worked out, and they still haven't worked out the right toolkit for dealing with this. The methodology we followed was we defined coercive diplomacy as non-militarized coercion, or the use of threats of negative actions to force the target state to change behavior. That's in contrast to checkbook diplomacy, which you've probably heard about, in which positive inducements and confidence building measures in the forms of foreign assistance or promised investment are used as rewards for countries. So it's a sort of carrot and stick opposites. We categorized coercive measures into two main buckets: economic measures like trade sanctions and investment restrictions, and non-economic measures like arbitrary detention and restrictions on official travel. We tried to gather as many examples as we could, and through open source research, in-language research with Chinese, English, other languages, and we did it over a 10-year period from 2010 to 2020. It was then peer reviewed by 27 experts from 16 different countries. But I would say from the outset, it's not a perfect methodology. One of the tactics that the CCP uses is to never draw very rarely draw a straight line between the threat and the actual issue that they're going after. So it's very hard to often be sure that this particular threat or action corresponds with that particular issue. For some states, particularly where there's greater state control of media, there's an incentive to try to cover up acts of coercion, because for fear that you're going to further undermine the relationship. So there's a bunch of reasons why, and we were often sort of conservative in terms of the measures that we included, and we didn't include, for example, coercion against civil society actors unless it was clearly linked to a state-on-state dispute. So I think it's probably an underestimate of of coercive measures that we've come up with. So in summary, what we found was 152 instances of Chinese Communist Party coercion between 2010 and 2020. Of those, 100 targeted foreign governments, and the remaining 52 targeted specific companies. We found that it was targeting 27 countries as well as the European Union, and that there'd been a sharp escalation in the use of these tactics from 2018 onwards. And the regions that were the most impacted: Europe, North America, Australia and New Zealand, and finally East Asia. The types of issues that the CCP uses this to punish are things like deploying Huawei's 5G technology, territorial claims, suppressing minorities in Xinjiang, the Dalai Lama, and its handling of COVID-19. I'll talk briefly about the categories that we used, and I know many of them are very familiar in Canada. The first was arbitrary detention or execution. I don't think I need to dwell on this for a Canadian audience. I know you've had direct experience of this, but this is one of the methods for coercion that we tracked, where an innocent civilian is sort of used as a means of trying to punish the state for a particular action. Another category was restrictions on official travel. So this is the sort of no speaks where suddenly your ministers aren't able to get appointments in Beijing, or even in the case of Australia, they can't even make a telephone call to their counterparts. So there's a sort of very childlike, no speaks going on. You have investment restrictions. This was a little bit of an anomaly in the data set. It tends to be used against the threat of withholding an investment or a joint venture or an infrastructure project tends to be used more with developing states. But in the whole, coercive diplomacy is really used against Western democracies. So this was not a big category, but it was one nonetheless where we tracked some cases. Trade restrictions, these are the sort of used quite widely. It involves concerted efforts to try and disrupt trade flows and restrict foreign access to the Chinese market through import and export restrictions. They can be triggered or facilitated through selective use of international regulations, targeted customs inspections, license denials, tariff increases, or unofficial embargoes. And this is where it sort of you get into this murky issue of vagueness, and where there's no clear lines between the two issues. So you'll have bizarre claims that your coal is got some phytosanitary issues, or there's some sort of unusual bug that's never been seen in any of your timber before, or your pork meat is killing people, but it's being consumed widely around the world. So all kinds of arbitrary sort of and ambiguous administrative and regulatory measures used there. Tourism restrictions were a pretty popular choice, given that the party can exercise control over a lot of its travel from its citizens, particularly around tour group operators. It's a tougher one to use during a pandemic. It didn't stop them from threatening it a little bit, but it was definitely one that was knocked back a little bit because of the reality of the pandemic, where there was no international travel going on. Popular boycotts are a sort of arm's length way of retaliating. These can be facilitated in a bunch of different ways. They can be spurred by state media articles or government directions, and they usually target companies with a view to punishing a state. So a good example would be Lotte Group, a South Korean company that was punished because South Korea decided to deploy the THAAD missile defense system. So it's targeting a company, but with a view to impacting a state. And then there's a category where we classed it as targeting specific companies, not necessarily linked to a specific dispute, like the THAAD missile defense system, but because the companies had done something, in the phrase in China is, hurting the feelings of the Chinese people. This is things like, labeling Chinese territories on marketing materials that, in ways that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't like, supporting pro-democracy movements, or making reference to politically sensitive issues. And this is where a popular boycott sort of targets a company, and then they boycott the company, and then they issue groveling apologies to win back the affections of the Chinese people. The final category that we looked at was state-issued threats. And this is the dominant way that both how other coercive measures sort of stem from this. But in and of itself, it can be sometimes an effective way of getting a state to change its behavior. These tend to be most of them tend to be pretty vague in how they're worded. So you get phrases like, there's going to be countermeasures, there'll be retaliation, we're going to inflict pain, or we have the right to further react. And these can come either from embassies, diplomats, and government ministries, or they can come from state-run media organizations. So to give you a sense of how that all played out in terms of the database that we came up with, we found that the state-issued threats were the most common form of coercive measure that was used over the last decade, but there was a really sharp uptick just in the first 8 months of 2020 when we released the report. There were more recorded cases of state threats than they were in the previous 9 years. Trade restrictions were the second most common method, and tourism restrictions after that. And then in terms of the countries that were targeted, Australia recorded the highest number of cases, followed by Canada and then the United States. And I'll just mention a couple of the sort of trends that we picked up. The first is that coercive diplomacy is really a tool used to target the developed West, not developing countries. So if you were a country that supported China's policy of persecuting Uyghurs in Xinjiang in the UN context, then you were pretty unlikely to have experienced coercive diplomacy. So that the allies of the countries that usually sort of back in China on issues tend not to be the ones that are targeted with coercive diplomacy. That's an area where you tend to have, and I shouldn't conflate the developing world with just supporting persecution of Uyghurs, but if you look at the sort of UN voting patterns, there's a very strong correlation between the countries that supported China in the UN on that versus the countries that experienced coercive diplomacy themselves or didn't. I guess the flip side of that is they're the countries that are more likely to experience the sort of inducement model, which is the checkbook diplomacy. Sharp increases in the use of state-issued threats really picked up during the pandemic. I think in part this is a compensation for the fact that other methods were removed during the pandemic. So, it was impossible to make a credible coercive measure threat in relation to, foreign tourists, for example, when no one was allowed to travel anywhere. It didn't stop them from issuing some of those threats, but it was sort of fairly toothless in the sense that no one was traveling anyway. I think it's also probably a leading indicator that the CCP has realized that coercive measures can be pretty effective, and that nation states don't have at this stage a good toolkit for responding. So likely reflects a thinking that this is a good wicket and worth using more of. Where we could identify target states' responses, so it wasn't always perfectly clear what the reaction of the targeted state had been to respond to a coercive measure, but where you could see where it had responded. If the issue was not threatening a strong national interest for that country, then they tended to capitulate. And they also tended to deal with the issue on a bilateral basis rather than trying to take it to a multilateral response. That's definitely the CCP's preference, to make sure that the state feels isolated and doesn't respond as a collective. But of course, for the targeted state, that's pretty much the worst possible option. A really good example of this, and an unfortunate one, involved Canada and Australia. Just days after the arrest of the Huawei CFO in Canada, the CCP arbitrarily arrested the two Michaels. But it took the Australian government 3 weeks before it was issued a statement expressing, and it was, the words were concern over the Canadians' detention. And the statement fell short of condemning the CCP's actions and didn't call for their immediate release. And this was despite the fact that 2 Australian citizens had been subject to arbitrary detention the previous year, and both of them were still in detention. So I think there you can see pretty clearly Australia's delay in issuing the statement meant that both Australia and Canada, as well as the US and EU, weren't unified in their response to the CCP actions, and therefore had essentially no impact in changing their view on this. I think one of the really interesting dynamics with coercive diplomacy is that states tend to be tricked into this belief that if they just stay quiet themselves, then maybe they can cut a better deal than the other state that they can see is facing exactly the same problem. So the instinct is not to band together and push back as a collective. It's to try and let the other state, deal with their problem themselves, and you deal with yours yourselves. And of course, as we've seen in many cases, that never works. I'll skip over some things, but maybe just mention a couple of things around coercive diplomacy against companies. This was a really thorny issue. I think probably more thorny than the targeting of governments. We documented 52 cases of pressure that was applied, or at least encouraged, by the CCP against foreign companies. And in many cases, the way this was done was by inciting a backlash from Chinese consumers, or things like blocking websites or adding legal penalties. This was a very effective strategy in encouraging capitulation. So of the cases we recorded, we found that 83% of companies had issued apologies, and almost no companies had their own government step in to help them. I think the most classic example that everyone's heard about here is the case of in 2018, when 36 global airlines were asked to change the way that they referred to Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Macau if they wanted to be able to continue to fly into China. There, I think you've got a case where every single airline ended up capitulating. Governments washed their hands of the problem and let the airlines deal with it bilaterally themselves. They all capitulated, but you could have seen a very different response if governments had have taken this decision upon themselves to make the call and banded together and said, we'll make our own decisions. Thank you very much. And if you're going to block our airlines from flying into China, then we'll take reciprocal actions ourselves. But of course, that did not occur. We've had some recommendations in the report. I'll just mention one. I think the main one was to clearly dealing with these issues on a bilateral basis is the worst possible approach you could take. It requires collective action. One of the proposals we put in there to do that was having the Five Eyes consider adopting a collective economic security measure, somewhat analogous to the Article 5 in the NATO treaty. That would enable them to use their intelligence capability to make an assessment on whether or not an act of coercion had taken place, because as I mentioned, they're not always explicit about that. And then once they had determined an act had taken place of coercion, to issue retaliatory measures to make it impossible for the CCP to continue using this method. So if, for example, you had Canadian pork products up to $100 million being banned from China, and that was determined to be an act of coercion, other Five Eyes members would agree to levy $100 million or double that in retaliation against similarly politically sensitive Chinese exports. And then I think you'd also have to have an agreement amongst the partners not to backfill the vacuum led by the boycott on their particular product. But I think that would be a measure where you'd really only have to do it once before there was a realization that this method could no longer be used very effectively. I'll leave it there, but I really look forward to your questions, and thanks again, Kevin, for the invitation to speak today.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that very fantastic oversight. That was excellent. So I think we can now open it up to questions. As I mentioned earlier, we have that Q&A function, so we encourage anyone that has a question to please feel free to just throw it in right there, and we'll make sure to get to it. Just to get the ball rolling, I actually have a question from one of our own branch members. So I thought I would start with that, and then we can move on to audience questions. So the question is, there are those like former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd who argue that the response to China has to be diplomacy, even if tension and conflict is inevitable. Forgive me. There's obviously no simple solution to the problem, but how does one engage diplomatically with the country when it refuses audiences with relevant counterparts?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. Look, I think there's lots of challenges in the relationship with China. I think absolutely, diplomacy has to be the way, because there's, nobody wants to have a conflict with anyone. I mean, that's an outcome that nobody wants. I think we're up against the world is going through all countries in the world, I think, are going through a radical change in policy assessments on the way that the Chinese Communist Party is rising. We're seeing 180 shifts in the assessments about the approaches that they're going to take. There was a widespread belief, I think, for a long time that economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization. We'd have an integration and a sort of an acceptance of a rules-based international order. I think that's being very much questioned, if not accepted at the moment. So we've got it's a very different landscape, and it's a transition moment. If you can't talk with your partners, obviously that's a big problem. But I think with this kind of issue, it doesn't necessarily require, obviously sitting down and talking about it would be the best way to resolve it. But if you can't talk to your partners and you're just getting arbitrarily sanctioned for pursuing your national interest, then there's lots of diplomatic ways that you can do that. And the one I mentioned, I think, is the best way forward, that states that are being targeted have to band together and take collective measures in retaliation, or they'll just you're just accepting that this is going to happen. And I think the other thing is you don't have to sink down to the level of arbitrarily executing Chinese citizens. I absolutely don't think we should do that. But if we do have our citizens arbitrarily arrested or arbitrarily executed, I think you need to have strong collective actions that could be in another area, like economic sanctions, for example, that obviously don't make up for the loss of life that your citizens are experiencing, but at least doesn't leave you sitting on your hands, accepting it as a tactic to coerce you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the question, and thank you for that great response. So I'll move on to some of the audience questions, and right out the top, we have one from Kevin, and he says, thanks for taking our questions. On the detainment of Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, forgive me, do you think Canada's response so far has been adequate? Do you think there is a way to resolve the situation without giving in on the detainment of Man Wangzhou? Forgive me.
Yeah, look, I'm always reluctant to comment on other countries' policies, because that's their decision, and other countries can do whatever they want. My specialty is critiquing the Australian government, but I would say, just on we've had this exact same experience ourselves, and I think we've basically followed the Canadian model. We obviously don't have the Huawei CFO in custody, but we have lots of disputes on the boil. And I think at least the approach that we've taken is definitely not the right approach. If you just try to deal with this behind the scenes, if you don't take collective actions in response, then you basically just you're just going to keep on copying it. There's been a government directed announcement in Australia that all Australian citizens traveling to China are at risk of arbitrary arrest. So you couldn't get a more blanket statement about the risks that Australians face now traveling to China. That's, for our largest trading partner, that's obviously a huge deal to, face the risk of arbitrary arrest just by, traveling to China as any citizen. There's over 1 million Australians that, count Chinese heritage here, and, obviously lots of family links. So I think all of that is very, very difficult. To me, unless you work together to issue sanctions that are so punitive that it makes it impossible to keep on doing this, we're just going to have more and more of it. So if at the moment it's an effective strategy, and until we make it so it's not an effective strategy, we're going to keep on getting it.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Kevin, for the question. I'll move on to the next audience question. This one's from an always favorite, Anonymous. So thank you, Anonymous. He says, thank you for coming. Your report argues that coordinated multilateral pushback is key to forcing the CCP to wind back its increasing use of coercive tactics. Are there things that a country like Canada can do alone that could have a meaningful effect on China, such as limiting international students into Canada? Or is Canada comparatively too small to be able to push back by itself?
Yeah, look, I think there's two sort of pieces to that. One is the hardening Canada's ability to be able to I guess make its democracy resilient. So in Australia, we've gone through a whole process here of dealing with a lot of the issues that we've seen over a number of years that have gradually been corrupting or attempting to corrupt the Australian democratic process. So we've seen cases of politicians that have been trying to get donations where they've suddenly said the exact opposite of their party line on things like the South China Sea. We've had $100,000 in cash delivered in supermarket bags to the secretariat of one of our two major political parties. We've had arrests of individuals for foreign interference linked to, or we've had raids linked to foreign interference, and so there's been lots of issues there, and Australia has passed legislation to enable things like that. So we've had foreign interference laws, we've had a tightening of our process around foreign investment. We've taken a number of decisions on national interest grounds, things like making sure that we have vendors in for our 5G build that have come from countries where they won't face extrajudicial pressure from the government. So I think all of that adds up to a hardening and a resilience, building in some resilience to your democracy. So I think those are all measures that all democracies should be taking, not just against the Chinese Communist Party, but against anyone that's trying to interfere in Canadian democracy or Australian democracy. So that's the type of thing I think we can do individually that's very effective. The disputes themselves, in terms of pushing back, I think being, if you are going to try and deal with it bilaterally, being firm and robust is absolutely important, because as soon as you capitulate, you're just sending a signal that that's a very effective strategy, and you'll be pushed and pushed until you don't capitulate or you completely roll over. So I think just maintaining firmness in the positions you take for to uphold your rule of law in Canada, or to because if Canada decides it wants to have certain suppliers in its 5G build or not, all of those things I think are important to just stand firm on.
Excellent, thank you so much. So I'll just keep going through the questions. These are great questions, everyone, so please keep them coming, and I'll just follow again, prioritize if I see an upvote there. So I do see one, again, it's from our friend Anonymous. And the question goes, with Joe Biden in the White House, the US signaled it will be tougher on China than the last administration, and they even set up a task force to review how the US interacts with China. So do you think the new US administration will play a bigger part to changing the behavior of China?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. If you look at the Senate testimony of Blinken and the statements coming from the new administration, it looks like it's going to be in one sense a continuation of the previous administration's tough stance on China. I think we'd probably see a bit more nuance in some of the diplomacy, and there's obviously some differences in the way I think in what this administration is going to want from China versus the previous administration. So, for example, on climate change, I'm sure the president would want to see, China delivering some big initiatives on climate change. That's how you negotiate that when you're in a highly competitive relationship in other areas is a challenge that they're going to have to navigate. That's obviously going to be a different dynamic from the previous administration. But on the whole, I think they're going to be. There's going to be a broad continuation of the effort to try to be pretty firm with some of the more assertive and aggressive measures that we've seen from the CCP, and push back against efforts to sort of wind back the peaceful rules-based international order. I think they're going to be really keen on trying to make sure that there's support there for trying to continue that rules-based international order that's underpinned China's growth and prosperity and rise, but also provided a great public good to everyone else in the region and beyond.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, and thank you again for the question. So I'm just going to go next on the list, and the question's by Anonymous as well, asking a lot of questions today. Do you think an appeal to reason is more effective than appeal to emotion when dealing with individually coercive behavior? So it's a kind of a broad question. So.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's different ways to interpret that. Is an appeal to emotion of the Chinese Communist Party, or how that plays out. The other element to it is how it plays out, in a domestic political context and public opinion. I think that the Chinese Communist Party is very much focused on on raw power. So nothing will persuade them besides the raw power calculations behind this. So if you're strong and firm and it's clearly not going to work, you'll be able to withstand it. And if you're weak and you capitulate, you'll be quashed and they'll keep pushing. In the realm of public opinion, I think this is really interesting. So one of the dynamics that's happened in Australia is public opinion has dramatically turned against the Chinese Communist Party. I think well over 90% of Australians were polled the other day and said that they wanted the government to actively work to diversify our export markets away from China. So I think all of that has added up to a really complicating dynamic for it's a sort of own goal for the CCP in terms of trying to drive political change here, because the public is essentially the public opinion means that the politicians, even if they wanted to, could not easily revert back to a different approach, or the old way of managing relations with China. So that has been a really big fundamental shift here, and that's because I think of the transition to a much more assertive and openly hostile approach. So with the wolf warrior diplomacy, the sort of blind sort of approach, the approaches that sort of just drive a steamroller over the rules-based order or agreements that we've got in place, and I guess thuggish things like arresting people and executing them. That's never going to win hearts and minds in a country. So I think stuff like that has really fundamentally changed public opinion, and that makes it very difficult for politicians to it's a complicating factor that plays against the CCP.
Well, thank you again, Mr. Hanson. That was fantastic, and thank you again for the question. So again, I'm just going to keep going down the list. We have a lot of questions coming in. This is excellent. So this one is, again, from Anonymous, very popular today. How realistic do you think is economic decoupling from China for democracies such as the US, Australia, and Canada?
Yeah, I think it's probably one of the defining issues that's going to happen in the next few years. I think there's lots and lots of motivators behind this. So the change in behavior from the CCP is creating a lot of risk, I think, to companies. And if you're going to create a more risky operating environment and become more assertive and unpredictable in the way that you're going to operate in the international system, then that, of course, is going to drive companies to move away from that risk. So I think we're seeing that will be an inevitable push there. You're also seeing efforts. The last administration obviously took a whole bunch of measures that were. There was the trade war. There was measures to try and secure, to respond to, I guess, state-backed investment on new and critical technologies. There's been issues like the 5G build, where Western states have sort of slowly caught up to the sudden change in market dynamics there and the security implications of that. So all of those things, I don't see the new administration, saying that they're going to suddenly wind back all the tariffs and trade war measures that were taken under the previous administration. So I think a lot of that stuff is going to continue. And I think for as long as the CCP tries to drive a destabilizing agenda internationally, that's going to drive more and more decoupling, and there'll be an inevitability about it, where there's probably going to be a tipping point where states are going to start to demand secure supply chain for a bunch of products, and then the companies that have positioned themselves to offer secure supply will be the ones that will start to benefit more, and then there'll be a wholesale rush, I think, to try and be able to offer secure supply chain.
Thank you so much. That's excellent. And thank you again for the question. So I'll keep going along. We still have a lot of great questions here. Next one up is by Weaker, who asks, recently Chinese education minister was accused of disinformation over Australian safety following the misleading statements citing racism to discourage Chinese students from coming to Australia to study. So how do you think Australia should seek to take collective economic measures to tackle China's aggressive attack on education, which they note is one of Australia's third largest exporters, what they note here?
Yeah, look, it's this is an interesting example of the coercive measure. I mean, there are no international students coming to Australia right now because there's no travel to Australia. We're sort of hermetically sealed over here. So it's sort of one of these things where it's rhetorical in nature and part of this wider sort of spat, but also shows they're trying to sort of it shows just a bald-faced attempt to be coercive and for the various disputes that are going on. I think the big question we have in Australia is what to do about our international student profile. Personally, I think it's great to be able to be in an open education environment for students from all around the world, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with helping to educate Chinese students, and I think that's a great thing to do. But you also don't want to have you've got to maintain the integrity of your institutions in terms of being able to have academic freedom and say the things that they want to say. You've got to be careful not to be co-opted by the small number of people who are using your expertise to build, say, weapons programs in China, or stealing your intellectual property. So I think you've got to have your eyes wide open here. But I think the ultimate question here is, if they are going to use student numbers as a coercive tactic to try and bankrupt universities and institutions like that, then you do probably have to, unfortunately, look at diversification as a means to just maintain resilience and manage the risk of your organization. So I would anticipate a lot of diversification in Australia to handle that risk. I don't think we're going to stop educating Chinese students that want to come and get a good education, but I do think we're going to have to diversify, because for as long as the Communist Party wants to use that as a tactic.
Thanks so much for your response. Another great question. Thank you. So I'm going to keep going along, and this one's from an observer where he likes to say thank you. It's been very informative. Should we attempt to push back through a multilateral front? Do you believe the Five Eyes or the Quad are sufficient to counter China?
Yeah, I think the Five Eyes would probably be the best forum to me, because one of the big challenges you've got here is there's vagueness and opacity around the direct link. So, Australia, for example, called for an investigation into the origins of the coronavirus so that we could, be better informed for next time and learn the lessons from the outbreak. That was obviously, not a popular move with the Chinese Communist Party, and as a consequence of that, we've had our lobsters, our beef, our trees, our I don't know, barley, wine, coal boycotted from China. But there's very rarely in these instances a direct statement from the government that says, we don't like the fact that you're investigating something that we really screwed up on, and for that we're going to punish you by going after your lobsters. It's much more subtle. They're not connected like that. So if you've got the premier intelligence agency in the world that can make a credible assessment on whether it is coercive measure or whether it is in fact a legitimate trade dispute, I think you sort of need that as the foundational basis for a good capability here. And then if you look at the partners that are members of that, I think we've seen the trade war play out between the United States and China. The United States really is the only country that can deal with coercive measures bilaterally because it's bigger than China. But as a collective, obviously the United States is in that grouping, and China knows that it can't win in the trade war against the United States. So I think if you just had one singular example of this grouping issuing retaliatory measures, you would never have to do it again, because they would realize that it's not going to work and they're going to be the ultimate losers there. The risk, I think, for other countries is that if the Five Eyes just does it as a collective and China realizes it can't use coercive measures against those five countries, it's still going to be able to try and use it against Japan or Korea or India. So those countries will probably want to be included as well, so that they don't just get left out in the cold and have to continue to be subject to coercive measures as themselves. So there's a real sort of dilemma there for the countries that aren't in that initial grouping that does it, because you won't have to continually do it as a Five Eyes. You'll just probably have to do it once and at the most twice.
Thank you so much for your response, and again, great questions. It's been excellent, and I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions, and luckily we have 2 more questions left, so this works perfectly. So I'll just go to the next one here. It's again by our friend Anonymous. How closely do business and states need to work together when dealing with China? Businesses likely don't want their home state to interfere with their business efforts, but it is hard to have a strong pushback on any coercive actions by China if businesses aren't on board.
Yeah, Anonymous is prolific today, but they're all good questions. I think the business one's really interesting, and there's lots of dynamics to this. So if you take the individual cases of, say, a clothing company that prints a map of China that doesn't include parts of China that doesn't include Taiwan, and they get a boycott against them, it's quite difficult to manage that as a nation state, what to do with that. And what we've seen in practice is that the companies just end up making groveling apologies and they sort of get on with business in China. Where I think where your question might have been going is that if you have a misalignment between the political elite and the business elite, then you're going to be dividing your society and having a very, that's not a great way for any country to move forward. We absolutely have gone through this in Australia, where we've got a lot of businesses who sell the dominant part of their product to China, if not all of their export market is China, and they're very powerful voices in Australian political circles. I think that we've had what would used to be the dynamic there is the Chinese Communist Party would get upset about something. The business community would say, we need to smooth things over. You need to fix this up. And the politicians would, fix it up. What's changed now, I think, is a realization that there's been a fundamental shift in approach in China. There's much more assertiveness. There's much greater risk for companies, and it's a completely different operating environment, and it's a global problem. It's not just Australia facing this, it's Canada, it's the United Kingdom, it's countries all over the world, it's India, it's Japan, it's South Korea. So I think that has led to a closer alignment. Business community is obviously still worried about, disrupting trade with our largest trading partner, but it's not as vocal, I think, as it has been in the past. The other thing I should just mention is that, we're talking about China is very selective in the products it goes after. So you don't end up with a situation where all your products are suddenly banned. It tries to choose a couple of sensitive industries that have vocal constituencies. And in practice, what happens is you often end up with trade either increasing or staying pretty similar to where it was before. So there's a lot of noise and frustration within particular business sectors that are targeted, but the big picture is that the trading relationship is pretty stable. So there's different dynamics there, but I think by and large, the business dynamic is starting to change.
Thank you so much, and thank you again for the question. Actually, I saw one or two more come in here, so I'm going to try it, if you're okay with it. We still have a bit of time, so I'll try to get it to as many as I can here. And this next one actually is a very, very good question. Thank you again, Anonymous. So the question is, do you believe the growing assertiveness of the CCP, perceived as using coercive methods to pursue its interests and ignoring international rules and norms, is leading to a wake-up moment by the international community and could actually be starting to undermine its longer-term objectives for economic growth and regional global influence?
Yeah, I think absolutely. It's there's been a big overplaying, in my view of it. There's been a big overplaying of the hand of the CCP. You've seen countries all around the world realizing that for a long time the dominant view was in governments around the world that economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization, and essentially we'd have some form of democratic state that we'd be dealing with that would want to embrace the system that had helped it rise and would integrate into that system and become a constructive partner in the global order. We're seeing the exact opposite of that, and that's, I think, causing policymakers around the world to really realize that they made a big mistake in their assessments. And it's sort of an onion effect. So the countries in the immediate region have the direct recipients of this changed approach. They're well and truly across what's going on and feeling the pain, and then it's rippling out, and you're starting to see Europe. Europe's on a long lag, but some parts of Europe are starting to realize what's going on and reassess their approaches. So I think it's happening globally, and I think one of the manifestations of this eventually will be collective action to push back against that. And the stated aim of the CCP is we don't want to be boxed into a corner, we don't want to be contained, but the behavior that they're engaged with at the moment is absolutely driving that kind of it's inevitable that states will have to collectively push back. So I think it's a really unfortunate dynamic, but it's the one that we've been dealt. So got to just deal with that reality, and I think try to be as reasonable and firm as we possibly can.
Think you so much, and thank you again for the question. So I see a couple more questions. I think I'm just going to try to get to maybe we can get to two more here, or actually I think I see a third one, but we'll go to this one, and I'm going to end with one with Martin. So I think it's a good way to end. So the next one up then is it's by Uyghur. And how do you think democracies such as Australia should protect Uyghur diaspora given the prominent retaliatory threats against their families members in China?
Yeah, so this is I think a really important one. And it cuts across a lot of things. So a lot of the, we obviously have a large diaspora community here in Australia. It's a hugely multicultural country, as is Canada. And a lot of the community institutions have been unfortunately corrupted, I think, as a result of United Front activities. So we've got, it's very hard to find, community groups that haven't been co-opted in different ways. And that permeates into the very lowest, the very smallest little associations and groupings, and I think that's, and then you've got associations within universities that are monitoring students, and all of that, I think, is, it's so antithetical to our democratic ideas that, we've got to work through that and unwind it. So I think we've basically been asleep at the wheel as Western states on these issues, and it's absolutely incumbent on democratic governments to deal with that and make sure that, whoever you are, whatever community group, that you can, have a genuine conversation with your community, and you can be free to say whatever and do whatever you want within the limits of the domestic law. So I think, that's a big piece of work, but I think it's something that started here, but it's a problem that's, all over the globe, and something democratic states have to start grappling with. And I mean, sorry, one other thing on that. I mean, the media is another one. So we just did a study actually of the Chinese language media in Australia, and that again has gone from being a very lively, independent media to one that's heavily following and regurgitating Beijing's narrative and censoring news content that, is not the content that the Chinese Communist Party wants to see. So there again, you've got a process of trying to re-establish some independence in the media landscape, and social media is another one where TikTok and WeChat, I think particularly WeChat is a platform that's very tricky from a policy perspective, but one that also needs to be addressed.
Thank you so much. Fantastic questions, and of course, fantastic answers. So I think we have time for just one last one. So I'm going to give it to Martin. Thank you, Martin, for your question. And it's a good way to end things off. The question is, what do you think China will look like politically in 25 years?
25 years. Well, people in my position should never be making predictions that far out. Look, my hope is that there'll be a realization in China that the rules-based order has served China incredibly well, and peace and stability are the best thing for the Chinese people. They're the best thing for the party, and it's the best thing for everybody else. I think the reality is might not be as I'd wish it would be. The pathway that we're on right now is definitely not a good pathway. We're having wholesale assertiveness and focus on raw power, and it's inevitably going to lead to pushback from democratic states, and that's going to be something that is going to be confronting and challenging for the Communist Party to deal with. So yeah, I'm usually an optimist, but at the moment I'm not really optimistic about how the trajectory that the CCP is on. I think ultimately democracies will become, this will be a moment for them to rebuild and become even stronger. But I think for the Communist Party, I don't think it's going to be a great time.
Thank you so much for that. And I think that's all the time we have for questions today. But what a great and dynamic question period. Thank you, everyone, for your great questions. And I just want to thank you, Mr. Hanson, for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to come speak to us today on the other side of the world. So this is it's very much appreciated. And I know we're all muted, but I hope everyone can join me in a round of applause for our great speaker. So I also just want to take a quick moment to thank, of course, the CIC Edmonton board members for helping to organize this event. For Josh, one of our board members who is on this call, to make sure that we can get all the Zoom call working, and he's played an excellent support, so thank you so much. And thank you, of course, everyone for joining us today. If you enjoyed this event and you want to see other events like this, I very much encourage you to check out thecic.org. That's where we have all our events scheduled. For example, CIC Edmonton, we're doing several events later on this month in celebration of Black History Month, including an Afro Dance Wellness event on the 19th, and a poetry and quiz night on the 26th. Then in March, we have a fantastic event on the politicization of bureaucracy in the Kenyan context. So it's very exciting times for us. So we're really happy everyone can join us today. Thank you again, Mr. Hanson, for joining us. And I'll let everyone enjoy their day. Thank you again for coming.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, everyone. Great to chat.
Thanks again. Thank you, everyone. Thank you again for being here.